What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I was told to take loans for college the very same week my stepmom's daughter got the keys to a brand new house, and the worst part is that nobody in my family acted like it was unusual. They smiled, clapped, and posed for pictures like it was the most natural thing in the world, while I sat there wondering if I had completely lost my mind for expecting something even remotely fair. I had grown up hearing there was money set aside for me, not a fortune, just enough to make my first 2 years of tuition less brutal. My dad and stepmom repeated it often when I was in high school, so I believed it. It gave me a sense of security, like even if life was chaotic, at least that peace was stable. When the time came to apply, I thought I would finally get to use it. Instead, I was told in the most casual tone that it would be better if I took out loans because that is how everyone does it now, as if debt was some rite of passage I should be honored to join. The same evening, I walked into their house expecting to have a conversation about financial aid, only to find balloons tied to chairs and a giant ribbon on a set of shiny keys. Avery, my stepmom's daughter, was practically glowing while holding the keys to her own place, which my dad and stepmom had just purchased for her as a so-called investment. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a paper plate with cake, while my dad made a toast about responsibility and adulthood. The irony of it nearly choked me. Responsibility apparently meant me signing years of debt, while Avery got real estate handed to her. I didn't say a word that night. I hugged, congratulated, and pretended I was fine, because the last thing I wanted was to give them a chance to label me as bitter or ungrateful. But inside, something broke. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how many times I had been told that my future mattered, that my education was the priority. Yet when the moment came, my future got pushed aside so someone else could smile in photos on a porch I had never seen before that day. When I got home, I pulled out an old shoebox where I had been keeping little things from my childhood, cards, notes, random pictures. At the very bottom was a birthday card from my Aunt Carla. She had sent a check when I turned 13, with a note that said, "For your future, for college only." The words hit me like a punch. She had written it in her neat handwriting, underlined once, so there would be no confusion. Suddenly, I wondered how many people had contributed over the years thinking it was going to me, only for that money to quietly disappear. I sat on my bed staring at that card for almost an hour, replaying every vague answer my dad had ever given me when I asked about the account. I had never seen statements, never logged in, never had control, always just reassured it was safe and growing. Now, watching Avery's housewarming unfold, I couldn't help but put the pieces together. My so-called college fund had not vanished into thin air. It had simply been redirected. I sent Aunt Carla a quick text, "Hey, I still have the birthday card you wrote me with that college check. Just curious, did you ever hear how that account was doing?" I wasn't expecting her to respond right away, but she called me within minutes. Her voice was sharp, concerned, and she asked if something had happened. I told her, carefully, about Avery's house and about being told to take loans. There was a long silence, and then she said, "I wrote checks in your name, not anyone else's." That sentence echoed in my head long after we hung up. The next morning, I made my first quiet move. I froze my credit. I didn't announce it, didn't warn anyone, didn't explain. It was the one piece of power I had, and I wasn't going to leave a door open for someone else to use my name to prop up their plans. Later that day, Avery texted me, asking if I could co-sign something small, just for the utilities, to help her establish credit for her new house. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. I typed no, hit send, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about refusing. I knew then that I was done waiting for someone to do right by me. If they could hand out keys like party favors, then I could open my own kind of door. Maybe not to a house, maybe not to anything Instagram-worthy, but to the truth. And if they thought I would just quietly carry debt while they played generous parents in family photos, they were about to see just how much paper can hold a spine. I didn't have a plan yet, not a clear one, but I had a direction. That single line from Aunt Carla, "I wrote checks in your name," lit a fuse I could not put out, even if I had wanted to. And I didn't want to. For the first time, I felt like maybe I wasn't powerless at all. When I woke up the next morning, I still had that sentence from Aunt Carla circling in my head, and the more I replayed it, the more I realized I had never once seen proof of this so-called college fund that was supposed to be waiting for me. Which suddenly seemed ridiculous because if people had contributed, if money had been given in my name, then why had I never been shown a single statement or given any access to it? And why was I now being told to carry years of debt while someone else was casually handed a house? That question kept me restless until I finally decided that if no one was going to hand me the truth, I would have to start pulling the pieces together myself, quietly, without announcing it. Because the last thing I wanted was for them to cover their tracks while I was still trying to figure out what actually happened. I started with the obvious, which was digging through old emails and letters, because I remembered moments when relatives had written checks or sent money explicitly meant for me, not for the family in general, but with my name on the envelope. My graduation card, my birthdays, and the words "for college" written in clear ink. It didn't take long before I found a handful of them tucked into old folders, notes that mentioned how they hoped I'd use this money to chase my dreams. And suddenly it felt less like a vague suspicion and more like a solid timeline of intent that I could actually put on paper. That same day, I walked into the financial aid office at my college and asked for help, which was when I first met Ms. Green, the counselor who, with a single look at me and my nervous folder of notes, seemed to understand the weight I was carrying. She explained things in plain English, not with legal jargon but with clarity, saying that if money was given to me, even if it was under my dad's name for convenience, then it wasn't some family pot to be spent however they wanted. Because legally and ethically, donor intent mattered and custodial accounts were supposed to be for the beneficiary, not the custodian. That word, beneficiary, felt like a weapon I had been denied, but finally handed. I remember sitting there, nodding slowly, as Ms. Green told me that I had options, and that I could even mark on my aid forms that my parents were not contributing if I had evidence, which would shift how my financial need was calculated. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was leverage, and for the first time I felt like maybe I wasn't just at the mercy of whatever decisions my dad and Denise had made behind closed doors. She also told me that documentation was power, that what I needed most was a clear, calm timeline that anyone could look at and understand, without emotional outbursts or vague accusations, just dates, amounts, and intent. So that weekend, I sat down with every scrap I had, every old email, every card, every screenshot of the rare times I had helped my dad with online banking back when he claimed he was too busy, and I built a single-page document. It wasn't fancy, just a simple list. Here are the contributions, here are the dates, here are the transfers, here's the window when the house down payment was made. I circled the overlap, the one detail that showed, in plain black and white, that money which was supposed to go to my education had been redirected elsewhere. When I looked at that page, I didn't see a sob story anymore, I saw a case, something that could stand on its own without me even needing to speak. The hardest part was deciding whether to keep it private or to make it visible, but I kept hearing Aunt Carla's voice, and I knew hiding it would only protect the wrong people, so I drafted a short message to my dad and Denise. I didn't rant, I didn't accuse, I just wrote, "I need clarity for financial aid purposes, so I've pulled together what I have, and here's a summary. Please confirm if I'm missing anything." Then I attached the one-page document and, without hesitating, copied Aunt Carla on the email. Hitting send felt like the first real step I had ever taken toward protecting myself. Within hours, Aunt Carla responded directly to me, thanking me for sharing and saying she had no idea this was happening, and then she attached her own short note confirming that her contributions were always intended for my education. It was only a paragraph long, but it carried more weight than any speech I could have made, because it was proof from someone outside the household, someone who couldn't be brushed off as dramatic or confused. That note became the backbone of everything that followed. When my dad and Denise finally replied, their messages couldn't have been more different in tone. Denise wrote a long paragraph asking me to stop involving extended family in private matters, framing it like I was embarrassing them or creating unnecessary drama, while my dad's message was short and almost careless. The account was under my name for convenience. He probably thought that line would calm things down, but when I read it, I almost laughed, because Miss Green had told me that was exactly the kind of admission that mattered most. He had just confirmed what I needed, in writing, without even realizing it. I didn't reply right away, because I knew that every move from this point forward needed to be deliberate, not reactive. Instead, I forwarded the entire chain to Ms. Green and asked for her opinion. She wrote back almost immediately with one sentence that made my stomach flip: "That statement will help you more than you think." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about trying to claw back what I lost. It was about showing them that I wasn't a powerless kid anymore, and that I had learned how to play the game on their level. I went to bed that night with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks, because I knew the silence in our family group chat and the sudden tension at dinner tables wasn't weakness on my part, it was pressure shifting. For once, they were the ones sweating about what might come next, and I was the one quietly holding the page that told the story better than I ever could. I didn't sleep much the night after Ms. Green's email, but it wasn't because I was panicking, it was something else entirely, something quieter, deeper, like the hum of clarity settling in my bones. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to what had been done to me. I was planning, calculating, organizing facts into actions that couldn't be dismissed with a shrug or a guilt trip. I realized that if they had treated my future like a side note in their financial story, then it was time I stepped out of the margins and rewrote the narrative entirely, not with yelling or confrontations, but with documents, timelines, and signatures. The next day, I went back to Ms. Green's office, and she connected me with a legal aid clinic that offered guidance to students in complex financial aid disputes. I walked in with the same folder I'd built, the timeline, the birthday cards, Aunt Carla's statement, my dad's email with that accidental confession, and after reviewing everything, the woman at the clinic looked up and told me, very plainly, "You have a legitimate basis for a demand letter." I didn't even know what a demand letter really meant at that point, but the phrase itself sounded like something adult and sharp, something that didn't need to shout because it came with authority baked into its very format. She explained that I wasn't filing a lawsuit, at least not yet, but that I could make a formal, written request for restitution based on misappropriated funds from what was clearly a custodial or trust-style arrangement. She said there were terms for this: breach of fiduciary duty, constructive trust, unjust enrichment. I didn't care much about the legal jargon. What mattered to me was that there was a structure, a process, a path that didn't require me to beg or plead for fairness. It was simply a matter of stating facts and offering a remedy. So we drafted it together, slowly and carefully. The letter spelled out the total contributions that had been given to me over the years, cross-referenced with family records and communications, all documented in that one-page timeline. We noted the timing of the transfer for Avery's house down payment, the fact that no consent had been given to use my funds for another purpose, and the fact that donor intent had been explicitly violated. At the end, we offered a repayment proposal, monthly installments, totaling the amount diverted, with a suggestion to secure the arrangement through a lien or recorded agreement tied to the property. I had never sent anything certified before, never needed to, but walking into the post office and asking for that green slip of paper felt more satisfying than I could explain. It wasn't just mail, it was the moment I moved from being a daughter asking questions to a young woman making a demand backed by paper, precedent, and principle. I kept a copy of the receipt, scanned the letter, saved everything twice, and then I waited. But I didn't stop there. That same afternoon, I contacted the mortgage company listed on Avery's house purchase. I asked for their verification department and requested confirmation of any financial contributions tied to my name, gifts, transfers, cosign statements. They didn't say much, but they took my information seriously enough to promise a call back, and that was enough to rattle the illusion of control that Denise and my father had wrapped themselves in. A few days later, it became clear that the call had gone through. Denise's tone shifted almost immediately. I got a message from her that read more like a threat disguised as politeness. "It's really unfortunate that you've decided to go this route. This affects everyone." That was her way of saying, you were supposed to stay quiet. But I wasn't going to apologize for finally protecting myself. Then Avery reached out. Her message was short, just a question. Did you just mess with my house? I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. I had drafted several versions, one defensive, one sarcastic, one brutally honest, but in the end I deleted them all and typed something that was simple and impossible to twist. I asked questions about my college fund. She didn't answer right away, but later that night she sent me a photo of her house keys resting in her hand with a caption that said, "Don't ruin this." And that was the moment I realized how fragile their whole operation had become. For all the bravado and confidence, it only took one letter, one inquiry, one traceable fact to shake the ground they stood on. My father, who had always presented himself as the peacemaker, suddenly stopped responding to my texts altogether. Denise started sending messages that were clearly written with lawyers in mind, careful, vague, and deeply uncomfortable. I wasn't planning to drag anyone through court, and I wasn't interested in revenge for the sake of revenge. What I wanted was fairness, clarity, and a path forward that didn't leave me cleaning up a mess they made while they smiled in family photos. If they were going to treat me like an afterthought, then I would treat them like a liability, professionally, calmly, and without hesitation. By the end of that week, I had drafted a second letter, this one addressed to Ms. Green and the Financial Aid Board, outlining the situation, attaching the demand letter, including Aunt Carla's statement, and requesting a reassessment of my dependency status. I made it clear that I was being financially isolated by my legal guardians and that their actions had directly jeopardized my access to education. Ms. Green read it carefully and said it was exactly what she needed to escalate the case internally. I didn't tell my father I had done any of this. I didn't announce it in the group chat. I didn't call Avery to explain myself. I simply put the pieces in motion, because sometimes justice doesn't look like a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like folders, signatures, and deadlines. And as I checked my email one last time before bed, I saw a message from the mortgage company. Your inquiry has triggered an internal review. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just closed my laptop, brushed my teeth, and went to sleep knowing that for the first time in my life, the consequences weren't mine to carry. They were theirs. When the message finally came from Denise, it didn't start with an apology or even a basic acknowledgement of what had been done. It opened with something that sounded suspiciously like a favor. Let's sit down and talk this through. We don't need lawyers or paperwork between family. I read that sentence 3 times before realizing that what she really meant was, let's handle this quietly, so we don't lose control of the story. There was no genuine concern in her tone, no attempt at understanding, just damage control disguised as diplomacy. And while a part of me, the part that still remembered childhood dinners and car rides to school, wanted to believe we could just talk and resolve this with maturity, another part, the part that had spent the last month documenting every inconsistency and unspoken betrayal, knew better. They hadn't cared enough to include me in the conversation when they were making the decision to redirect funds for Avery's house, and they certainly hadn't paused to consider the consequences when they told me to take out loans, like everyone else. Now that the pressure was mounting and the threat of exposure was no longer theoretical, they were suddenly interested in peace, but only on terms that kept them clean and me quiet. Still, I agreed to meet, not because I expected some breakthrough or heartfelt moment, but because I needed to look them in the eye one more time and show them that I wasn't bluffing. We met at a local coffee shop, one that was neutral, public, and impossible to escalate into a shouting match. I arrived early, ordered tea I didn't even want, and waited with a folder in my bag and my decision already made. When they walked in, Denise had her usual tight-lipped smile, and my father looked like a man caught between a storm and a rock, hoping somehow both would pass if he stood still long enough. There were no hugs, no pleasantries. I pulled out one sheet of paper and slid it across the table before either of them could launch into small talk. It was a clean, simple proposal. Repay the amount diverted from my college fund, not in one lump sum, but over time, in monthly installments. Nothing punitive, nothing outrageous, just the exact amount. Secured through a recorded agreement against the property they had used the money to purchase. I made it clear this wasn't a threat, this wasn't revenge, this was structure. A way to make things right, slowly but officially. They read it in silence. My dad looked like he was trying to figure out whether this was something he could talk me out of, while Denise's jaw tightened visibly with every sentence. She glanced up, asked me if I really intended to attach legal paperwork to Avery's home, and I responded with the same tone she had used in her message, professional and flat. This is the only way I can be sure the agreement means something. If it's not recorded, it's not real. My dad tried a softer angle, asked if we could just work it out as a family, maybe with a handshake or a shared understanding. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You already made the decision without me. This is the only way I have to make sure I'm not erased from the outcome too." I told them they had 1 week to sign. No rush, no threats. Just a deadline. If they declined, I would move forward with the financial aid appeal, the legal complaint, and the mortgage company's review process. I wasn't bluffing. Everything was already in motion. This wasn't a warning. It was a courtesy. That same day, I sent a second package to Ms. Green, a formal aid appeal with all supporting documentation, including the demand letter, Aunt Carla's statement, and copies of the contributions that had been diverted. I requested reclassification of my dependency status and included a signed statement explaining the financial estrangement and breach of intent. Ms. Green responded with a short but powerful sentence, "You've built a bulletproof case." Meanwhile, I called the refinance officer listed on the public record of Avery's property and informed him that a repayment agreement would likely be recorded against the home within the week. I didn't go into detail. I simply let him know that any future financial activity involving that property would need to reflect that lien. He said he understood and thanked me for the heads up, which I knew would send a ripple back through Denise's world faster than anything I could post online. A few nights later, I received a text from Denise. No greetings. No sign-off. Just a line that said, "We will sign, but remove the part about recording against the house." I stared at it for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to feel every inch of what it meant to be here, at a place where I had real leverage, where their preferences no longer outweighed my rights. I typed slowly, making sure every word was exact. The recording is the part that makes it real. Otherwise, it's just another promise I can't afford to trust. She didn't reply. That weekend, I went to a notary and had everything prepped and waiting. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even nervous. I was just clear. This wasn't about making them hurt. This was about making sure I didn't spend the next 10 years paying for their decisions while they threw parties on someone else's porch. I had given them a choice in writing, and for once, it was a choice they couldn't edit, guilt trip, or sweep under the rug. It was sitting in front of them with a pen and a deadline. And whether they liked it or not, the paper had a spine now, and so did I. They signed. That's how this part begins, not with some dramatic showdown or late-night apology, but with 2 dry signatures on a document they never thought they would have to face. There was no ceremony, no admission of guilt, no warmth in the way they handed the papers back to me, just quiet compliance and a forced civility that told me they were hoping the whole thing would disappear once ink hit the page. But for me, those signatures meant everything. They meant control. They meant proof. They meant that, for once, I wasn't the one sacrificing for the sake of keeping the peace. The peace had been broken long before I ever wrote a demand letter. I had simply stopped pretending I couldn't feel the cracks. With the signed repayment agreement in hand, I filed the document as planned, had it officially recorded, and watched as the process finally turned from personal to institutional. The repayments wouldn't be sent to me as random checks with half-hearted notes or conditional generosity. They would be automatic, scheduled monthly, and pulled directly from the same account that had once conveniently lost track of my future. No negotiation. No discretion. Just quiet, recurring accountability. Avery didn't say anything to me directly after that, but I heard from someone in the family group chat that she had cried when she found out about the recording on the property. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard it. I didn't feel guilty either. I just felt done. Her comfort had been bought with my sacrifice, and now it was time for her to feel, for just a moment, what it was like to be affected by a decision you didn't get to make. My financial aid appeal was approved. Ms. Green's voice on the phone carried a tone of pride I hadn't expected. She said the board had reviewed the documentation and agreed that I qualified for reclassification as an independent student due to financial estrangement. That one change in status opened the door to grants and scholarships I had never even known existed. She also helped me secure a small departmental scholarship, not because my grades were perfect, they weren't, but because I had shown grit and self-advocacy, two things they apparently valued more than a spotless GPA. I took on a few more shifts at the campus library, applied for a quiet research assistant job in the history department, and adjusted my schedule to balance everything. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every step I took after that didn't require permission or apology. I wasn't asking anyone to do right by me anymore. I had done right by myself. My dad reached out a few weeks later with a request. He asked if I would keep the agreement private, especially during Avery's housewarming, which had been rescheduled after the paperwork distraction, as Denise called it. I read his message while I was waiting in line at the dining hall, and for a brief second, I considered saying yes. Not because I owed them anything, but because the old version of me, the daughter who always played along, always made excuses for people, always stayed quiet so others could be comfortable, still lived somewhere inside me. But I didn't say yes. I didn't even say maybe. I replied with one sentence, I won't be attending. That decision was met with silence. No arguments. No follow-up. Just the familiar void that always followed when I did something that didn't fit into their version of who I was supposed to be. I had finally stopped twisting myself into something more palatable for them, and they didn't quite know what to do with that. Instead of standing in someone else's photo op, I spent that weekend finalizing my class schedule and filling out forms to remove my father and Denise from all university records. I updated my emergency contacts. I removed them from my health insurance and closed every shared financial tie we had left. It wasn't out of spite, it was a decision made with the same precision and clarity I had used to build my case. If I was going to move forward, I needed to stop giving them access to doors they had long since slammed in my face. A few months passed. Payments arrived on time, exactly as scheduled. I watched the balance go down, not with joy, but with a quiet satisfaction that something, for once, was working the way it was supposed to. There were no more texts from my father, no more let's talk emails from Denise. Just silence, structured and clean, like the kind you get from a closed tab or a finished chapter. Then, right before winter break, a message came through from Denise. Short. Almost flippant. Would you be open to pausing the repayments until after the holidays? I read it twice before responding. There was no apology, no context, just a request, like we were still living in a world where favors were owed and boundaries were optional. I opened the folder on my desktop, scrolled down to the signed agreement, screenshotted the clause about repayment terms, and replied with one sentence, "This is the last message about it." I haven't heard from her since. I don't know what the future holds with them, and I'm not pretending I don't still carry some weight from all of it. There's grief in this too, grief for the version of family I used to believe in, grief for the years I spent thinking I was just being impatient or dramatic or selfish for wanting what had been promised to me. But that grief isn't the end of the story. Now, when I walk across campus, head down and earbuds in, I know exactly where I'm going. I know who's paying for each class, and it isn't the version of family who told me to take out loans while unlocking someone else's front door. It's me. I earned that. I protected that. And when I finally hold the key to my own apartment, modest, small, but fully mine, I'll carry it with a kind of pride no one can take from me. No ribbon. No party. No photos for show. Just a quiet understanding that the door I'm walking through was never open for me. I built it, fought for it, and turned the lock myself.